are going to be moving to national languages like Spanish, not international languages like English. So we want to be clear about our, let's say, social and intellectual ambitions with this collection of books. The history of this project comes from Oliver. He wrote an article, a paper, more than 10 years ago on the history and creative traits of the European video game. And then we were very much inspired by the well-played special issue on the history of European video games in the 80s, edited by Clara Fernandez Vara and Bennett Foddy. So from there, I was writing for an online cultural magazine for a general reader in 2017 about E3, and I wrote down, I was quite surprised by Yves Guillemot, the president of Ubisoft, saying that they were proud of making their games in Europe. It was the first time that I saw someone in such an international event celebrating and defending this European production, perhaps not European identity, but European production. It made me think about it. It made me go back to the paper that Oliver wrote 5 years before that. We went to the issue edited by Clara, and we started talking among us and with other colleagues about this space of the European video game that was not being discussed anywhere. And as I said here, this is, I think I had it, yeah, here. This is something that is not normally identified as folkloric. We rarely think of European folklore. We think of Italian folklore, Polish folklore, Spanish folklore. But when it comes to Europe, we talk about bureaucracy and economy and these kind of things. So it was a matter of identifying what made this region different, putting together this flexible idea of region, while at the same time avoiding essentializing the region. And these are things that I have learned and I have had to deal with in my work with Japan Foundation. I've been working with Japan Foundation now for 4 years, I think, 3-4 years. And we are very honest all the time, every time we do something, with the fact that we come from Europe and we analyze Japanese video games from Europe, from a European perspective. So we first needed to define region. This very complicated term had a practical side with regional lockouts, a practice that is still going on in some parts of the industry, but not so much. It used to be the norm a few years ago. Video formats in the 90s and early 2000s, PAL, SECAM, NTSC, they were separations. There were borders in the international sphere. So in a way, talking about Europe was talking about PAL, even if SECAM was in France and other things, but PAL was identified with Europe, NTSC with America and Japan, and this was a technological separation, but also the regional corporate divisions. Spain didn't have a Nintendo office until very late in the game, and the arrival of Nintendo, for example, came from entrepreneurs from India. So this idea of opening local and national branches is also key central in creating regions. We also added 2 factors: local institutions and cultural policies that shape the market and the production of video games within these regions. But this was the practical approach of thinking about regions in Europe and trying to create this picture of Europe as a region without looking for an essence, looking for folklore, or looking for identity traits. I have a strong allergy to identity, especially because when you do that from Europe, you kind of become quite colonial and it's pretty arrogant. So it's a complicated part of dealing with regional game studies and with this approach to region. So we try to avoid it. And if you look at the table of contents, you will see that the book was divided into national stories and transnational approaches. So from the first moment, we tried to balance the content of the book with this idea that Europe is composed of diversity, united in diversity, this very idealistic ideal with national stories and transnational collaborations. And they were, these transnational collaborations were not easy from the beginning. Both the cases and the study of the cases always were complicated. It's always easier to look for national cases, but this balance, I think, was quite successful in communicating the idea of what we were talking about when we talk about the European region. We had to identify some traits. These are 5 traits that we found in a very, very early approach. This is not an essence, this is part of historical tendencies, historical trends, and we are not married to these ideas. We identified that Europe had a longer tradition in realism, social commentary, a certain type of humor, a certain type of strategy games. The idea of indiness and authorship was very relevant, perhaps because we don't have this AAA muscle, but we tried to put the national traits, so to speak, into a very small box. Like, yeah, this is part of the region, but this is not the defining element of the region. We are looking for other kind of things. And this was the first book. This was the conversation that we had when we put together the first book. And I have to acknowledge that during that time and after that, we have been highly influenced by a collection of works that might be familiar to many of you here in the room. For example, the way Martin Picard reconceptualized Japanese video games as originally local, transnational products that were made for a local audience, and that had a difficult relationship with internationalization. And at the same time, they were local products made from international materials. Asma, for example, has written about how Japan is very good at Japanizing popular culture coming from mainly the United States. So these connections and movements were very inspirational from us. Japan is one of the founding places of video games, but they created this idea of the modern video games by absorbing American video games and then creating something local that was very successful and very exportable, very sellable outside of Japan. We have been using the concept of regional game studies for a long time, of course, and I think it's one of the founding texts of what we are talking about here today. So thank you, Bjarke, and say thank you to Paul as well. And from a political perspective, the work of Martin Roth has been very, very inspirational, huge inspiration for me, very influential, and it's very good at identifying local elements in a certain genre, a narrative genre, science fiction, without, again, essentializing the discussions to Japanese identity. This book is very good at discussing political debates without saying this is this way because it comes from Japan, which is kind of the first problem we find every time we do something about Japan outside of Japan. Certain Thomas Maikowski was a huge inspiration as well in our projects and our debate after the project. And I'm very happy to show this talk here because it was part of DIGRA India, so it's very, very international. This is the kind of language that we are using. This is the kind of references that we are using. And we have identified a double problem that's, again, this is very basic for the folk reunited here today, for the community reunited here today. But I think I'm going to present this not as something that I want to explain to you, but as something that we all together need to communicate to the general reader, to the general public, to the general player, so to speak. The problem with this idea of games of having no nationality, games live on Steam, on Nintendo Switch, on PlayStation, and so on and so forth, is that everything ends up looking the same. There's a million Metroidvanias in the market. We don't need more Metroidvanias, even if I like the genre. They all look the same to me now. So I'm quite tired of, for example, Blasphemous was very successful, but I have to admit that Blasphemous was successful not only because it's exploited Spanish culture, but because it was very identifiable as a Metroidvania and as a Dark Souls inspired game. So I have a problem with this sameness, this plurality of sameness. Even a couple of days ago, we had the case of the first video game made in Cuba. This is not a criticism of the game. I can see the strategy, but it's another platform game, Metroidvania-like, with the title in English. So it seems that we are celebrating the firsts, as Maria Garda will say, international firsts, while at the same time only allowing these firsts into the conversation, into the culture, if they look like games that have been made before, if they look like the same games that we are playing. So I think we have to look for the local, because this is something that the president of the Japan Foundation for Preservation, the Japan Game Preservation Society, told me. Even when you play the same game in a different region, the game will be different. When a game from Japan comes to Europe, the context is different. The game needs to be localized. There might be technological differences. So the whole packaging surrounding the game will be different, and the whole reception might be different. And the local comes in local audiences, local circulation cultures, events, the figure of cultural mediators, to say it with Pierre Bourdieu. This is different, and this shapes the local culture, even if everybody is consuming the same type of game. And the opposite element will be the problem with two local games, so to speak. We know that there is folklore in games. We have been talking about that for the whole day. But I'm going to ask if games are, when they are not literally folkloric, if they are ever local. Local meaning that they belong to these cultures of circulation in a local space. And yes, we have a million cases. We have sumo games, American football games. When I was a child, I was very baffled by American football games because that was very alien to me. There's a growing trend of games made in Southeast Asia that normally take from they take after influential horror video games, and they are very good at horror. And we even have decolonial, post-colonial projects like the Zibo console. Bruno de Paula is doing an amazing job in his research of the Zibo console. So we have local elements in game cultures, and these are communicated in, let's say, a clumsy manner. I don't know how many of you have played sumo games, but they are kind of naturally enclosed in Japan, and they are only of interest for people interested in Japanese culture. So these games shape the region in a way that's going to influence everything else. Even if you don't know about sumo video games, you can find sumo mechanics in games like The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, for example. This was the first contact of many of us with sumo mechanics. So we have a problem with, we video games in general, we have a problem with this no nationality video games, this plurality of sameness. But I personally have a problem with this idea of this potential idea of world video games. I'm not advocating for world video games. The labels of world cinema and world music are basically North American labels coming from the United States to separate, to distinguish things made in other countries. Like there is the international, there is the center, and there is the periphery, where people are making things, poor things. They are trying to make things like we do. They are trying to make popular culture like we do. So I abhor these labels. I don't want to see world video games as a label. But I'm much more in line with projects like the story of film that try to reconstruct the whole history of the medium by decentering the medium. It's a partial story of every as every story is, but it's a very complete story about film as an international field, as an international medium. So I think this is the right approach. Mark Cousins had the right intuition here, and he defines himself as and internationally, not coincidentally. So I think this is the right approach. We have to avoid world labels, so to speak, while trying to have a world medium in general. Because when we focus too much on the regional, on the folkloric, on the world, you end up with tourism. I've lived 10 years in Mallorca. I live now near Barcelona. Tourism is very good at sustaining folklore and national and local identities, and they become these products of mass consumption, these commodities that you are forced to perform for an international audience. I wouldn't like video games to become something like this, video games that exploit the regional identity to do this. So I don't want to, in my part as a scholar, I wouldn't want my books or my research to be pushing for this, or to be defending or promoting this kind of perspective. So yes, games are international. No, they are not the same everywhere. This is something that we all know, but we need to communicate it in order to perhaps rebalance the way we discuss video games international. I think we are, in a way, ambassadors of this right approach to internationalism, if you may. I have this very basic set of notes here. It's mostly meant for my students, but I'm going to share it with you. Again, it's very basic. It's not deep theory on folklore and such, but I think it's good to keep in mind that regional perspectives are good when they help us situate things in practical material and historical conditions. They help us identify dialogues, tensions, trends among regions, when they help us look for exchanges with other regions, and when they complete the global map. And they are not so good when they look for essences. Again, I work with Japanese games and Japanese culture all the time, and I'm very tired of dealing with people that simplify Japan as a single essence and say, no, this is very Zen, this is very Japanese, this is because of Shinto. The number of times I heard something explained because of Shinto, maybe Final Fantasy, Akira Toriyama, or whatever, is unending. Regional perspectives are not so good when they ignore global dynamics, when they put, as Sobik said, a region in the center as universal, and the rest become regional. Who gets to decide who is regional and who is not? When they simplify regional phenomena, for example, I'm a vegetarian, I'm defender of animal rights, so I can tell you that I don't like bullfighting at all. If I go someplace and see Spain identified with bullfighting, I'm going to struggle quite a bit. It's not so good to isolate regions, as we have said before, when they become cages, when they put people in these cages and they force people to adhere to a strict national identity. So again, we are not creators, but we are dealing with these products, and this is kind of the compass that we are using for the same, for the same project, and the second book in the same project of the perspectives on the European video game. This time we are going to publish the book in a collection I edit. I am the main editor of the collection Ludografías in Spanish, the first scholarly collection on game studies in Spanish, and we are going to publish the book in Spanish with collaborators from all over Europe, including Thomas here in the room. And we are going to be focusing just on histories, not essences, but histories. And the book is going to be a book on the micro histories of the European video game. So again, we're going to keep this local and interlocal balance, but this time going back to the past and identifying the origin of many phenomena, many things that we identify with the European video game today. So to close this presentation, I know that it's 5 minutes to the 30 minutes mark, so I'm going to try to do this in 5 minutes. I want to leave some food for thought and things that we are trying to keep in mind for the second book. Again, we have to take part. It's very difficult to be neutral when you deal with post-colonial movements, with post-colonial balances of power, and when you look for national structures, for international structures, and when you are in the vicinity of regional identities. So it's not, I think it's not commendable, it's not wise to remain neutral. And a way to keep the balance, at least for me, is to remember that regional games are always going to be international, because this is the way video games work. I want to focus on the ideas of the Galapagos syndrome and the idea of the misdelivery. Azuma, in his latest book, Philosophy of the Tourist, defends the figure of the tourist as someone that is not a vagrant or a wanderer, always moving, always traveling, with no the Rolling Stone gathers no moss, as the saying goes, as someone that doesn't build anything, and someone, the tourist, is neither the villager, someone that lives in the same place for their whole life. The tourist is someone that travels back and forth, that gets some very small glimpses of other cultures, and in these glimpses, they get misdeliveries, and these misdeliveries might be problematic, but they help articulate a kind of sediment of international exchange. So misdelivery is not necessarily bad. As Byung-Chul has says, we are all hypercultural today. We are all tourists of other culture. I love Japanese culture, Hong Kongese culture, Korean culture, and I'm not Hong Kongese, but I am quite fluent in the popular culture of the 80s and 90s in Hong Kong. So that's part of my hyperculture. But I have to admit that I might risk misdelivering the information that I manage, and the travelings back and forth are going to cause some misdeliveries, but these misdeliveries can be fruitful in my analysis of regional phenomena. This paper just came out, and I think this idea of the pluriverse in European video games is super useful. Again, I'm very wary of ideas like idealizing cultural heritage or identifying strong local identities, but I see the point, because this paper defends transnational networks. So even if you identify strong local identities, the moment you connect them in a transnational networks, you are going to be thinking in a much wider map, in a much wider jigsaw puzzle. So it's going to be balanced, even if you don't have that goal in mind. So I think it's we are always going to be in the vicinity of these local identities, but if we keep international networks in mind and exchanges, that's going to be healthy. For example, I love Japan. Japan loves Europe. Japan has a lot of theme parks on Europe, on Spain, on Britain, on Porto Europa, and these are very, very clear cases of misdeliveries. Porto Europa doesn't look like Spain or France or Italy at all, the real life Spain, Italy, or France, but it looks like an idealized dream of Europe for the Japanese public. And I think it's quite harmless, and it's quite, I find it endearing in a way. Games like Super Don Quixote, this is not loyal to the original text of Don Quixote, but it's a very nice reinterpretation in the shape of anime tropes. For example, this is a very typically Japanese game utilizing, exploiting American icons, North American icons like the Disney traditional characters. When you have American creators, North American creators, US creators creating this homage or whatever to Kurosawa, it's a case of misdelivery. Kurosawa was perhaps the best director of its time when it came to color, but they identify black and white, samurai, and very, very stern characters with Kurosawa. This is not Kurosawa at all, but it's, let's say it's a noble attempt. And in this misdelivery, we are seeing dialogues where the ness of Japanese-ness, American-ness, European-ness is in motion, is being renegotiated, and is being opened for the public to discuss. And we'll finish with the Galapagos syndrome. As you may know, the Galapagos syndrome means when an organism gets isolated and evolves in a different manner. You have many cases like that when it comes to video games in Brazil. I'm going to Brazil next month, and they have a lot of Japanese video games, Japanese consoles that took on a different life there in the material conditions of the Brazilian market, like the Monica character taking the role, the spot of Sonic the Hedgehog, or Sega becoming a somehow Brazilian company, not a Brazilian company, but a Brazilian console with strong ties, strong roots in Brazil. So these are the takeaways. Again, very simple, very practical. I have to apologize for that. This is not very technical, not very theoretical, but this is the honest inner dialogue or interdialogue with my colleagues that resulted from editing the first book and from trying to edit the second book. So very quickly, contextual and historical factors, material and practical conditions, local creators, player structures. These are very important things. Regional approaches should always be global. Global approaches should always account for regional variations. We have to be wary of centers and peripheries, of essences and exceptionalism. It's always nice to identify these Galapagos syndrome evolutions, and we have to keep in mind that regions, like invented traditions, are ideas and abstractions, but they are realities and specific realities, to be precise. And regional affordances should be a way of opening up conversation and collaboration, and never a prison or a tool for exclusion. So nobody needs to be forced to be regional. This is all. Sorry for not being there. Open to your questions and comments and whatever. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.